Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of Flowers and Faith, where we are combining our love of flowers and Bible study. So, in this series, we are discussing faith, what it is, and in this episode, we'll be discussing how we can increase it. But to give a quick recap, in the first video, we discussed what faith is. In Hebrews 11:1, it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." So despite us not being able to see the things that God has promised us just yet, we know that they will happen. We also touched on Hebrews 11:6 that states, "And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." And lastly, we touched on how much faith we should have, and that even with a mustard seed of faith, we can move mountains, as Jesus says in Matthew 17:20. So today we are going to discuss how we can increase our faith as believers with illustrations of faith throughout the Word. So today I will be going over Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 31. And this is when Jesus walks on the water. I will be reading from the NIV translation. Starting at verse 22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" So again, that was Matthew 14:22 through 31. So I want to talk about Peter's showing of faith when he walked on the water. So Peter's initial faith allowed him to walk on the water, but his doubt, the circumstances around him, the things that he could see, the storm, the winds, caused him to sink. So again, in this verse, Peter had a little bit amount of faith. He had the faith of a mustard seed, and he walked on the water. Jesus and Peter were the only two people ever to walk on the water, right? So if we look at what Jesus said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Many people tend to focus on how much faith Peter had in this instance. They focus on the little bit of faith that he had. But I think the focus should be on the next part of that sentence, which is, "Why did you doubt?" Jesus already let us know both in Matthew 17:20 and Luke 17:6 that when we have faith as small as a mustard seed, great things can happen, right? And as we can see here in these verses in Matthew chapter 14, Peter had a little bit of faith and something miraculous happened. He's the only other person to ever walk on water. So that little bit of faith that Jesus is telling us throughout the word that we need to have is the same amount of faith that Peter was able to use to walk on the water. But the faith isn't what the issue was. It was his doubt. When we allow our doubts to overpower our faith, it then prevents us from continuing on to doing those great things God has said that we will be able to do with that mustard seed of faith. We start to sink just like Peter did here. Despite popular belief, faith and doubt can exist at the same time. It can exist simultaneously. I know people try to tell you that it can't, but we see it here where Jesus said to Peter, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" So clearly he had some faith. It was a little, but he also had doubt. And if we also go to the book of Mark, in Mark chapter 9, when Jesus healed the demon-possessed boy, the boy's father actually says, "Help us if you can," right? And Jesus replied in verse 23, saying, "If you can, everything is possible for one who believes." And immediately in verse 24, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." So what I want to say is one of the ways we can increase our faith is by asking God to help us overcome our unbelief. God is aware that we have doubts. God is aware that we are human. But he is also giving us examples of when we can increase our faith and how we can increase our faith by simply saying, "Hey, can you please help me overcome my unbelief?" As I was being prayerful and asking God how I should segue into the second episode and the third, the fourth, however many he may have for me to do, I was trying to get an idea of how I should break the next episode down and what I should talk about. And, he gave me this and reminded me of a sermon of Dr. Tony Evans that I listened to last year, June 2nd, 2024. I'm not sure if that was the actual date that the sermon was preached, but it was the day I believe I watched it on YouTube. And in that sermon titled "Start Walking on Water," Dr. Evans talked about this chapter in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 31, and about Peter walking on the water. And one of the things when I reviewed my notes from the sermon that stuck out was how he explained the dynamic of belief and unbelief. He explained that when doubt rises, our faith shrinks. And when faith rises, our doubt shrinks. And it's very evident here in Matthew chapter 14 with Peter walking on the water. As Peter's doubt, because of the circumstances around him, continued to rise, his faith shrunk and he started to sink. And I think that is like many of us today. Just like Peter, as we look at our circumstances, as we look at the things that are overwhelming us, as we look at the news and see what's happening in the legal sphere and politics and all these different areas of our lives, as we look at our bills, as we look at that car payment that hasn't gotten paid and we don't have the money, as we look at our bank account and there's no money for food, as we look at these different things, we allow our doubt to continue to increase. And while that doubt continues to increase, our faith continues to shrink and we begin to sink. So we're no longer doing that miraculous thing that God is attempting to do in our lives because we are allowing the doubts and the circumstances to define us rather than our faith. And so one of the ways that we can continue to increase our faith and continue to just keep our faith is to ask God to help us overcome our unbelief. Whatever it is that may be causing you to not have belief, ask God to help you in that area. The apostles in Luke 17:5 asked Jesus specifically to increase their faith. And as we know, Jesus replied in the next verse, 17:6, saying, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you." When God brought me back to my notes from Dr. Evans' sermon from last year, I did a whole self-reflection section and a prayer section. And in the self-reflection section, I wrote, I need to be more honest with God about how I'm feeling and what I'm actually going through, how bad things actually are. And I think a lot of us aren't able to overcome our unbelief because we aren't honest with God about what's truly going on. So in closing, we need faith the size of a mustard seed, Faith and doubt can operate simultaneously. And if we allow our doubt to increase more than our faith, that doubt can cause us to sink, just as Peter did here in Matthew 14. So I pray that this message was helpful to someone, that it reaches someone. Share it with someone you think it may help their situation. And more importantly, guys, pray, ask God to increase your faith, and be honest with Him about what's going on in your life. God bless.